Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome everybody to our webinar this evening. And to get us started, I know there are several people that are probably still signing in, but we have well north of 120 people signed in already. So think it's time for us to get started. So with that, Nancy, I will turn it over to you to begin our program.
Thank you, Maureen. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nancy Leifer, and I want to welcome you to this webinar. I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Montana, and on behalf of the League and on behalf of our other sponsors, I'd like to thank you for being here. Our co-sponsors this evening are the Citizens Climate Lobby, Climate Smart Missoula, Families for a Livable Climate, Great Falls Rising, the Montana Environmental Information Center, Montana Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate, the Northern Plains Resource Council, Wild Montana, Wilderness Watch, and the League of Women Voters of Billings, Bozeman, Helena, and Missoula. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots organization that encourages informed and active participation in government and works to increase people's engagement in government affairs and from a place of being informed about the issues. We are happy to have you all this evening here tonight, and we are pleased to also have presenters from the Montana Climate Office and the Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribes. We are hoping to engage in a discussion of the climate extremes in Montana, as well as a presentation, and to share stories of resilience in the face of these challenges and changes. So please do use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen to pose questions and comments to the presenters. And please feel free to pose those questions as they come to you throughout the presentation. If there are questions, for example, about clarifications, we may actually be able to answer those midstream, either by breaking into the actual presentation or by having you watch in the Q&A box for an answer to your question. But please do ask questions. We're looking forward to a lot of audience participation. We are recording this presentation and we'll be posting it on the League's website in the next few days. So I want to now turn this over to our moderator for the evening, Maureen McCarthy, who will introduce our presenters and moderate tonight's discussion. Maureen is a research professor in Earth and Science Ecosystem Sciences at the Desert Ranch Institute, and also an affiliate faculty at the Montana Climate Office at the University of Montana. Her research is focused on building partnerships with Native communities in the West to enhance climate resilience. Maureen is a member of the Missoula League and also on the climate committee for the Montana League. She lives in Ronan and on the Flathead Reservation of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. So Maureen, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see everybody here tonight. I am thrilled to have such wonderful attendance. This is an exceedingly important event, and we look forward to your input throughout the course of the evening. As Nancy mentioned, you are welcome to put questions in the Q&A box at any time. We will not be opening it up for verbal questions, but put your questions in. We will be moderating them as we go along. With that, I normally do a land acknowledgement when I start my talks in my professional world, and I am exceedingly honored to be living on the land, the ancestral land of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, in the current land of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes in Ronan, Montana. So with that, I will welcome our first speaker, who is a colleague and good friend, Dr. Kelsey Genso, who is your state climatologist. And Montana has one of the most active and largest and most engaged climate offices of any of the states in the country. And you are exceedingly lucky to have this resource in your backyard, even if you are across the state in eastern Montana. So with that, Kelsey, please take it away.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here, and thank you, Maureen, for that great introduction. Let's see. Okay, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone. When Maureen asked me to give this talk and talked about this talk, she asked me to kind of present on some of the recent extreme weather events that we've observed in Montana. And being the state climatologist, I couldn't help but not include within this talk today a description of kind of where we've been in terms of Montana's historical climate, our present climatic conditions, and also an acknowledgement of our future climatic conditions. These have huge implications when we think about the potential for aridification and drought events like we've seen in the last couple of years, or extreme flooding events such as we observed in the Yellowstone River Basin this spring. I'm really excited and humbled to be presenting in front of this group, and I'll also admit that I'm a little bit nervous to present in front of such a prestigious group, but I'm excited to be here today. I also want to acknowledge all of the staff in the Montana Climate Office. The work and the presentation today really builds upon the backs of the work that's done within the Climate Office, including Colin Brust, our information specialist, Kevin Hyde, our Montana Mesonet manager, Kayla Jamerson, who's a graduate student in the laboratory, Zach Hoylman, who's the assistant state climatologist, and Kyle Basinski, who's the director of climate extension. A lot of the activities that we're conducting are really built upon great and fantastic work that they're conducting across the state and the larger region. So my talk today, I'm gonna talk again about kind of our current and historic climatic conditions, but I'm also going to build upon a presentation and work that was done in 2017 as part of the first ever Montana climate assessment. This was done under the supervision of the Montana Institute on Ecosystems and Kathy Whitlock at Montana State University, Bruce Maxwell, Wyatt Cross with the Montana Water Center. And as the Climate Office, we developed the climate projections and forecasts as part of that climate assessment. It focused on not only first ever climate projections in Montana, but an understanding of the implications of those projections for agriculture, forests, as well as water supply. So I want to start off with just kind of a big picture view. And I'd like to ask everybody to just take a look at this map. We've all seen maps of Montana before, but really this highlights how important Montana is. Montana is truly a headwater state. The land area draining from Montana encompasses and drains to the Columbia River Basin, the South Saskatchewan River Basin, as well the Missouri River Basin, the upper Missouri, the lower Missouri, and into the Mississippi River Basin. And so if you add this land area up, Montana forms the headwaters that drains into almost 1/3 of the land area of the conterminous US. And so what happens in Montana in terms of our climate or in terms of seasonal weather extremes, whether it be drought or flood, has a huge and cascading impact within Montana. It impacts our economy, it impacts our public health, but it also impacts a lot of downstream water users that are very dependent upon our headwater state. And so as we think about the variability in climate and how it may change into the future, as well as just recent climate extremes, these impacts have disproportionate impacts on the rest of the United States. So tonight I want to focus on an overview of Montana's climate trends and a brief discussion of some of the recent extreme climatic events that we've observed in the last couple of years, and try to make some linkages between those events. At any time an event happens, people want to know, is this climate change? And so to kind of draw some linkages between our projected future changes, as well as the events that we're starting to see in terms of their frequency and magnitudes. And then really I want to talk about some of the initiatives and approaches that we're taking to start preparing and adapting to these anticipated changes. As we think about future climatic changes, it's really important to think about critical climate infrastructure monitoring and assessment so that we can adapt, mitigate climate change, as well as to respond on a seasonal basis. So we can take advantage of opportunities during wet, good years, but also respond to, say, dry years or years where we have seasonal flooding events. Oops. Having trouble moving forward here. Sorry. Before I jump into kind of Montana's climatic conditions, I think it's important just to kind of have a climate 101 and think about all of the complexities and drivers of Montana's local climate and our hydrological cycle. The weather conditions and the climate conditions that we experience here in Montana are derived from a mix of systems that impart impacts at both global scales. So we have large conveyance or circulation systems at global scales, Hadley, Ferrel, and polar cells, atmospheric circulation cells that act as conveyor belts or poleward conveyor belts of both heat and moisture. We also have gyres within the ocean, but generally they act to redistribute heat and moisture from the equator to northern latitudes here in Montana. At a more regional scale, we have things like the polar jet stream and the subtropical jet stream that act to redistribute heat and moisture from the Pacific West Coast in an easterly direction towards Montana. And seasonal undulations in these in the jet stream impacts the distribution and conveyance of low pressure systems and moisture from the Pacific West Coast that impart and impact things like snowpack in our high mountain elevations, or seasonal rainfall events and atmospheric rivers, which is a topic of discussion, a very recent topic of discussion related to the Yellowstone event. At a more local scale, Montana is really complex. We know that we are a very diverse state in terms of our topography. In Western Montana, we have the Rocky Mountain front, and the change in topography associated with our mountain systems impacts the distribution of precipitation and temperature within Montana. We know that as we move up higher in elevation, we tend to see greater accumulations of precipitation on a seasonal basis, the accumulation of snowpack, which drives the storage and potential impacts to our spring and summer stream flows. That water storage, those mountains are the water towers of Montana, and they store seasonally significant amounts of water. And so we're very dependent upon them and the effects of topography on our distribution of precipitation. Seasonally in the summertime, we have scattered convective storms that are associated with convective uplift across the state. And really, I'm spending a little bit of time on this. You could spend an entire semester in college talking about this, but really I'm highlighting all of these to say that Montana is really geographically complex in terms of its climate and hydrology. And so this makes it difficult to understand and predict future conditions, as well as just the weekly weather forecast. We see highly varied conditions across the state in terms of our water availability, our soil moisture, and local weather conditions. Okay. But if we look at that range of variability across the state, I'd like to move into kind of a historical description of Montana's climate. Sorry, I'm moving the screen around here. If we look at the historical range of variability across the state as a whole, or on average, our current average annual temperature is about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's cold, right? We all know that it's cold here in Montana, but there's a lot of spatial variability in those temperature distributions. So as we move from Western Montana towards Eastern Montana as a whole, and in general, we tend to see warmer conditions as we move, say, from Western Montana and the Rocky Mountain front into Central and Eastern Montana. Over time, and if we look at changes in temperature, this is associated with weather stations that have been operating back to 1895. But if we look at a trend in temperature starting in the last 65 years, on average, Montana's temperature has increased by about 0.42 degrees Fahrenheit per decade, and that's over the last 65 years. That rate of change varies depending upon the window of time that you look at, whether it's from 100 years versus 30 years or over 65 years. But in general, this is an overall increase of about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit across that 65-year period. And that change in temperature is actually much more significant or greater relative to the national average. So this is a change associated with greenhouse gas emissions and increases in temperature over time. And in comparison, if we were to look at the average temperature increase for the United States as a whole, that rate is about 0.26 degrees Fahrenheit per decade since 1950. So it's a much lower rate relative to Montana. And the simple explanation for that is that Montana is at a higher latitude. And again, I highlighted these global circulation cells, the amplification of warming tends to be higher as you move higher or in a northerly direction, higher in latitude towards the northern hemisphere. That's again associated with the redistribution of heat and moisture in the atmosphere as well as within the ocean. So higher latitudes tend to be more sensitive to these changes in temperature. Try to click here again. But taking a look at historic precipitation trends, we really haven't seen much of a trend in Montana. Again, we have a diversity in precipitation. We all know that Western Montana tends to be much wetter in the wintertime. We have the accumulation of significant amount of precipitation as snowpack in the mountains. So along the Rocky Mountain front in Western Montana, we can see upwards of greater than 50 inches of precipitation as an annual average. But as we move west, as we move easterly across Montana, we see a decline in precipitation. As you move into eastern Montana, parts of eastern Montana are actually close to being classified as arid or desert-like environments, so almost less than 10 inches of precipitation on an annual basis. And this goes along with the saying that in Montana, we're always in a drought. It just depends upon how extreme that drought may be. So subtle differences in precipitation on a seasonal or annual basis can really trigger drought conditions and a dry down in portions of central and eastern Montana. Across the state as a whole, our current average annual precipitation is about 18.7 inches. And if we look statistically over time for the last 65 years, there has been no change in annual average precipitation. So there's not a statistically significant trend over the last 65 years. However, if we start to break the state up, and if we look at portions of Western Montana versus Eastern Montana, there are some statistically significant trends. So in Eastern Montana, there's actually been about a 1.3 to 2 inch increase in the spring. In Western Montana, we've seen about a 0.9 inch decrease in Western Montana. And that's been linked to changes in the El Nino Southern Oscillation, just the frequency of La Nina and El Nino events over the last 60 years, where we've had a higher frequency of the El Nino events, which are linked to typically in the wintertime, warmer and drier conditions in Western Montana. So natural variability. Looking towards the future, as we think about these changes, one of the ways that we can assess those changes is through global climate modeling. And in a simple way, what we did in Montana in 2017 as part of a initiative across the university system, as well as in partnership with local groups, state agencies, is developed the first look at Montana's projected changes. So we used a series of global climate models, and in a really simple description, these climate models are the state-of-the-art, best scientific practice for estimating a series of physics and chemistry-based equations that take into account the components and interactions of climate variables and human activities. In a more simple description, these climate models take into account the transfer of heat, momentum, water, and conveyance of those between our atmosphere and circulation within our atmosphere, its interactions with our land surfaces, our oceans, as well as our cryosphere or ice-covered surfaces. And so these models have been updated and improved upon for a long period of time, dating back to 1985. And over time, there's been a series of models that have been used to update our climate projections. Currently, we're up to the CMIP-6, or the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project 6 model ensemble. The Montana Climate Assessment was developed in 2017, based upon the CMIP-6 ensemble. And so what I'd highlight here is that over time, these projections and models, the science behind them is improving, but there is some degree of uncertainty in these models and their estimates. And so we have to update these models and projections on a regular basis to continuously update and assess potential changes in future climate. CMIP-6 is the most recent addition, And I'm really excited to kind of talk about this tonight. This is the work of Colin Brust and Kyle Basinski in our office. They're updating this assessment. It's based upon 8 different models. So each of these models represent different aspects or do slightly different jobs in terms of representing the interactions between our ocean, our atmosphere, and our land surfaces. And they're all acknowledged as the best models for the northwestern United States. They do a good job of resolving kind of topographic influences on moisture and heat distributions. So we combine these 8 different models into what's called an ensemble. Again, recognizing that they all have different strengths and different weaknesses. This gives us a range of projections or outcomes that we might expect in terms of things like temperature, precipitation, wind speed, and changes in those variables over time. Importantly, those models are at a very coarse or global resolution. And so one common approach is to downscale them. We downscaled these models and their projections to a 30-kilometer resolution using the NASA NEXT CMIP6 downscaling approach. And that's a large acronym, but fundamentally what we do there is use historical observations from weather stations and accurate, precise observations from weather stations to form empirical relationships or statistical relationships with the historic model predictions. And we use that to then carry forward into the future at a higher resolution, so at a 30-kilometer resolution. Okay, with these ensembles and the models themselves, we use what's called now a multiple or a shared socioeconomic pathway. For those who are familiar with climate modeling, you've probably heard the term RCP scenarios, so the representative concentration pathway. That's associated with greenhouse gas emissions and the degree of emissions associated with anthropogenic activities, our combustion of fossil fuels, and other greenhouse gas emissions. The shared socioeconomic pathways, it's a new term, but it accounts for the anthropogenic emissions as well as multiple kind of cultural and societal decisions that we might take as we move forward. And so it varies from the SSP 1-26, which is kind of the best case scenario where we make significant reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions, all the way up to SSP 8.5. This is kind of the business as usual scenario where we continue to burn fossil fuels and emit greenhouse gases at a steady rate. For the presentation tonight, I'm going to show that more extreme scenario because that's currently the pathway that we are on by mid and end of century, unless significant changes are made. As well, within these scenarios, we do a comparison of historical conditions, so 1971 to 2000, with mid-century and end-of-century conditions. So from 2040 to 2069, and end-of-century being 2070 to 2099. For the talk today, I'll focus on those mid-century conditions because that's not that far away, and that's what we're looking towards in the upcoming decades. So here's a kind of a brief overview of the results. Again, there are a lot of different metrics that I could cover tonight, but I'm already short on time. But just taking a look at change in temperatures. Again, by mid-century, this is with the business as usual scenario. Across the state, we see a little bit of variability, but we see a strong temperature or a strong greenhouse gas effect on our seasonal temperatures. I'm moving my screen again. I'm sorry, guys, I can't see. So for this scenario, if you look at north central and then eastern Montana, there's approximately a 5-degree Fahrenheit increase in eastern and north central Montana by mid-century. That change is slightly less here in western Montana. It's about a 4-degree Fahrenheit increase in central and western Montana. One thing I forgot to note is that, again, we use this ensemble as a range of predictions. These are our best estimates based upon the best models of these potential for future changes. But one of the benefits of using multiple models is, again, they all vary in their precision and ability to represent different aspects of the climate system. By comparing the models, we can look at the degree of model agreement. And this is a coarse measure of uncertainty in the model outcomes. And so I've stated here the temperature trend, there was 100% model agreement. What this means is that out of 8 of the models, all 8 models predicted a positive trend or a positive sign in the change in temperature. If half of the models had predicted an increase in temperature and half of the models had predicted a decrease, we'd have 50% model agreement. So this is a rough estimate of the degree of certainty in these model outcomes. And again, time and time again, we've seen with the various model ensembles that temperatures are expected to change, and it's been consistently about 4 to 5 degree Fahrenheit increase on average in terms of the annual temperatures. But that's only part of the story, right? When we think about Montana, it's really the seasonal temperatures and the variation in those seasonal temperatures that are really important. Here I've shown an increase in the days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can think about this as the spring and summer conditions that we experience here in Montana. And this metric is highly variable. So again, this is related to the number of days across the state where temperatures exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is representing the change from our current conditions by mid-century. Again, this is spatially variable. So if you look across the state, eastern Montana, we're anticipating upwards of 39 more days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas here in western Montana, you can really see the effects of the mountains themselves and higher elevation environments. The valley bottoms themselves tend to warm a bit more, so roughly 10 to 15 days. But we've got this area of white shading associated with mountains. You can see that associated with the little belts and the big belts in central Montana, where that change is upwards of 1 to 2 days. So not a big change there. Again, with these change in 90-degree days, we found that there was 100% model agreement. So all models agreed in the trend of that direction, or the change in that trend. I'd highlight here that those days above 90 degrees are really important, right? Those have significant impacts in terms of heat stress to humans. Our public health has a big impact on our crops and their ability to withstand extreme temperatures over time, especially when water's limiting. These are the days where we have significant drying out of our soils, of our forest litter layers, and the potential for fuels to develop in terms of fires and fire starts. And so this metric becomes really important as we think about our summertime conditions and the potential for large wildfires, public health impacts, et cetera. Okay. Taking a kind of another look at seasonal temperatures, there is some variability in terms of the timing of these temperatures. This Gantt chart is showing the distribution of temperatures and the increase in temperatures across 7 regions of Montana: southeastern Montana, northeastern, south central, north central, southwestern, and western Montana. And then the colors here represent the degree of change associated with each month during the year. And what I'd like to highlight here, just to pull out kind of the big picture, is that when we look at the summertime conditions in Montana, that's where we see the most significant warming. In the summer, we're anticipating, on average across all of these regions in Montana, about a 6.4 degree Fahrenheit increase. Wintertime, we expect about a 5.3 degree Fahrenheit warming. And that seasonal increase in the winter, in the fall, that becomes really important for thinking about the longevity of our snowpack. When does the snow that's accumulated in the mountains begin to melt? And what is the phase of precipitation as it occurs in the spring? Typically, when we have spring precipitation at high elevations, that falls as snow and accumulates and is stored. But with these increasing temperatures, we're definitely expecting to see an increasing amount of rain on snow events, which can lead to rapid melting of the snowpack as well as flooding events. And so this is something to pay attention to as well. Okay. When it comes to precipitation, the good news is that we are expecting a slight increase in annual precipitation. And there's already some evidence for this, especially in eastern and central Montana, where we've seen increases in precipitation over the last couple of decades. But that increase in precipitation, what I'd highlight, that the annual increase in precipitation is small relative to the effect of aridification and warmer atmospheric temperatures. It's going to have kind of a cascading impact on evaporative loss of moisture that does fall as precipitation. This is showing the change in annual total precipitation. And again, you can see that it's spatially variable. We're associated with the mountains in southwestern Montana and northwestern Montana. We're expecting to see about 2.5 more inches of precipitation. And in central and eastern parts of the state, it's roughly about 0.4 to 0.5 or half an inch of precipitation increase. What I'd highlight with precipitation is in climate modeling, precipitation is a very difficult variable to predict. There are a lot of dependencies in terms of atmospheric circulation cells and patterns that influence changes in precipitation. And so when we look at the degree of model agreement here, we have 63% model agreement. This means that 5 of the models suggested an increase in precipitation, and 3 of the models suggested a decrease in precipitation. And those changes are relatively small when we think about how much precipitation this represents. Okay, but importantly, we can think about the seasonality of this precipitation and how it might impact, say, drought conditions or extreme precipitation events. So again, this is a Gantt chart showing the change in precipitation across our 7 climate regions in Montana. And what I'd call out here is that winter, spring, and fall are all expected to have increases in precipitation. So represented by the green shading here in the winter and as well in the fall. We're expecting to see decreases in terms of seasonality in summer precipitation. That's up to about 0.2 of an inch of decrease in precipitation. And that may seem like a small amount of water, but if you think about it climatologically, summers are very dry in Montana. And so that 0.2 of precipitation is actually a big change in precipitation relative to what we typically see here in our dry summers. The other thing here that I'd highlight is there's about 92% model agreement in terms of those positive changes in precipitation for both these winter, spring, and fall. That certainty decreases when we look at summer precipitation. The model agreement's much lower in the summer, 63%. So there's a degree of uncertainty in this estimate, and this is something that we need to update and keep track of over time as these models and estimates improve and as conditions evolve in coming decades. Okay. One of the implications that I really wanted to get into and highlight when we think about increasing temperatures, but also increasing precipitation in the spring. Again, we're used to nice and ample snowpack here in Montana. We are expecting an increase in future winter precipitation, upwards of about 0.4 to even half an inch in some regions in northwestern Montana. And one of the considerations, though, is that with those increases in spring temperatures, more of that precipitation is likely to fall as rainfall on top of snowpack. And then when we think about warming temperatures, that has big implications for the timing and release of our stored winter snowpack. That impacts our stream flow, both in the spring, but also late into the summer, where those groundwater contributions from mountain systems are key and important for sustaining base flows, sustaining cool stream temperatures, and our in-stream aquatic environments for fish. So it has big implications for kind of tourism and recreation across the state. This figure on the right shows, and produced by Kyle Basinski again, shows the future April 1st snow water equivalent. So this is the change in snow water equivalent by April 1st. So this would be the snowpack remaining on April 1st relative to current conditions. So as we look at northwestern Montana, about 60% relative to present day conditions, about 60% of our water that's contained in the snowpack will be present on April 1st. As we move to eastern Montana, those numbers decrease, so roughly 28 to 29% as we move into central and eastern Montana. So there's going to be significant losses of snow water equivalent earlier in the season, and that's associated with increased temperatures. From a positive perspective, those decreases in terms of the timing of our snowpack are actually a little bit less relative to our neighbors in, say, Idaho, Colorado, and other mountainous regions. And so we're still looking good. We will have snowpack and probably more ample snowpack relative to some of our neighbors. Okay, so just to summarize the climate check section, across the state, temperature is expected to increase, and that amount of increase is really sensitive to emissions. Again, our models suggest that with increasing and continued emissions of greenhouse gases, we're going to see these strong and positive increases. From a positive perspective, it also means that we have a lot of opportunity and room to impact those increasing temperatures through policy shifts, changes, and mitigation of our greenhouse gas emissions. To some degree, there's strong model agreement and relatively low uncertainty in those estimates of temperature changes. And there's also spatial differences in the extremes that we see across the state in terms of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Precipitation is generally expected to increase across the state, but it's much less sensitive to emissions, meaning that it isn't expected to change as drastically. There's also moderate model agreement here. We have a bit higher uncertainty in those estimates and predictions of precipitation, and we are expecting to see strong seasonal differences. There's more confidence in those estimates for the fall and winter and less confidence as we move into the summer time period. Okay, so I just wanted to turn and after that kind of overview of climate and climate change in Montana, just to provide, Maureen asked me to think about some of the more recent climatic extremes that we've experienced here in Montana. And two drastic extremes came to mind over the last couple of years. The first is what we just experienced this year. And what was really interesting about this year is we can go from really wet to really dry really quickly. So this year we kind of came out of the winter with about a normal snowpack, and it was actually really cold this year. Our snowpack persisted late into June, especially at higher elevations. And so we had this rich and ample snowpack at high elevations. And then we had a series of atmospheric rivers. So we combined atmospheric rivers and rain on snow events with an ample and melting snowpack in June. And this resulted in pretty catastrophic flooding, or a 1 in 500 year event in the Yellowstone Basin. When we think about atmospheric rivers, these are these large conveyor belts of moisture that typically originate from the tropical Pacific. And as the jet stream moves these rivers across the Pacific West Coast and into Montana, they come into contact with a topographic barrier of mountains. As that air mass is lifted up and over the mountain system, temperatures cool, and that leads to what we call the saturation vapor pressure, the point at which that air mass can't retain any more water, and water condenses and it falls from the air mass. Atmospheric rivers, importantly, can contain a lot of water. So one atmospheric river can transport as much water as, if we were to take the volume of the Mississippi River at its outlet, it can contain as much water as 7 to 15 times the volume of the Mississippi River at its outlet. So it can produce a significant amount of precipitation, which is really important for us here in Montana in terms of spring snowfall and even wintertime snowfall. Typically, these atmospheric rivers don't occur much past June in Montana. And so this event in and of itself was very significant in that it happened in June. There is some research, and Maureen can comment on this much better than I, but that suggests because of warming atmospheric temperatures, the atmosphere itself has much more capacity to retain water. And so the magnitude and the amount of precipitation that these atmospheric rivers can drop will increase. In the case of Montana, we had an atmospheric river event plus delayed snowmelt. So if we look across southwestern Montana and the Yellowstone Basin, our snowpack was on approximately 214% to 178% of normal for June 11th when this event began. Okay, and so what happened is we had rain on snow and rapid down slope transport of moisture through the soil as well as on the soil surface, and that resulted in so again, it was about 2 to 4 inches of rainfall, and I'm moving my screen again. That resulted in a 1 in 500 year flood event. So the previous record recorded at Corwin Springs in Yellowstone, it was exceeded in terms of the stream height by about 2.5 feet of water, a very, very significant event. Maureen, I'm already over my time. I apologize. The other extreme that comes to mind are just the regular and frequent occurrence of droughts in Montana. We're still in a drought from the last 3 years. In 2017, we had what was called a flash drought. This was a period of time where we had again, we came out of the wintertime with ample snowpack and good moisture conditions, but essentially record-breaking May and June temperatures, as well as record low rainfall. It was on par in certain parts of the state with the Dust Bowl era. Record low rainfall, so it was our second driest year on record, contributed to a rapid dry down across the state. The impacts of this event included almost 1.4 million acres burned across the state associated with the rangelands and forest. This was the second largest burn year on record in Montana. Poor air quality and health impacts, and then significant losses of crops and livestock across the state. The second major contributor to our economy. And then the first major contributor to our economy, we had significant decreases in tourism and recreation across the state. Maureen, I'm going to go through this really quickly, and I apologize for going long. There have been a series of reports associated with these extreme events, as well as just our projections of climate change and what we can anticipate in Montana. I've put a hodgepodge of those reports here. And really what I want to highlight is that in a lot of them, as we think about adaptations and responding to seasonal events like flood or drought, or in the long term changes in climate, all of these reports have highlighted that there's a need for more ground-based stations and observations of things like soil moisture, weather, rainfall, of snowpack, so that we can make better predictions of flood conditions and the potential for flood conditions, so we have early warning, or for drought conditions and drought predictions. And so one of the key goals and the things that the Montana Climate Office and others are working on is to really capture and better monitor our weather and moisture conditions across the state of Montana. It's a really big state, and historically there's been a paucity of monitoring, and that hinders our ability to respond in given locations and characterize these conditions as they evolve. And so one of the things I want to highlight, I'm just going to skip forward. We're building what's called the Montana Mesonet. This started in 2016 as a cooperative and collaborative framework. We installed 6 stations in 2016 as part of our AgriMet network. This is a network of weather stations that are recording weather variables like precipitation, temperature, relative humidity, wind speed and direction, lightning strikes. And then importantly, below ground, we're measuring soil water content, or the volume of water that's in different layers of the soil. In Montana, that's a key variable for understanding drought conditions or the potential for flood conditions as the soil water reservoir fills up. And so we're building this network out. It's increased over time through partnerships with many federal and state agencies, tribes across the state, and then just local landowners that see the value in this, especially from an agricultural perspective. Recently, we received an award. This is part of Senate Bill 4444, the Missouri River Basin Drought and Snowpack Monitoring Act. This is really exciting. It's a bipartisan effort. It was introduced by Senator Thunes and Rounds in North and South Dakota, but approved by the 5-state delegation. This is occurring across Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and as well Nebraska. Stations are going to go in, new climate grade weather monitoring stations and snowpack stations are going to go in the upper Missouri River Basin at elevations below 5,500 feet. Because Montana is the headwaters of the Missouri River Basin, we'll be installing 205 new stations in the next 5 years. So we'll be staying busy. And this is a $21 million contract associated with building better climate infrastructure and monitoring conditions within the basin. Here's a look at the big picture. So again, this is occurring within the upper Missouri River Basin. Each of these squares represents a location where a new station will be sited. Again, we're installing 205. The white circles represent locations that we'll be installing next year. The black circles are stations that are already installed. And then this also includes our neighboring states. When this is completed, it'll be one of the densest meteorological networks in the world. And this will result in improved just daily weather forecasts, flood forecasts, and better drought monitoring. All the data from these stations is public and online. They're collecting data every 5 minutes. If you're interested, I've provided a link for that here. They also collect photos on a regular basis, and so you can actually see what the weather conditions are across the state. So I'm going to skip over. Yeah, I'm going to skip over there just to highlight and summarize. So Montana is going to see decreasing summer water supplies due to enhanced evaporative losses and reductions in soil moisture, groundwater, and stream flow. Flood potential, I say, may increase here. A lot of this is dependent upon the timing of our rain on snow events and the degree of precipitation and the change in precipitation that we experience in our mountain environments. Importantly, our unique geography contributes to spatial differences in how much, how fast, and where these changes are going to occur. And so accurate monitoring and dispersed monitoring, updated climate assessments are critical to informing our response and adaptation measures.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelsey, very much. That was a fabulous walk through some very complicated climate modeling and also a touch on some of the extremes we've experienced. I encourage everybody who is on to please reach out to the Montana Climate Office if you have follow-on questions that we don't get to this evening. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Kelsey, if you could stop screen share, I would appreciate that.
Yeah.
And excellent. Thank you. And Mike, if you could bring up your slides, please. And while you're getting started, it is my great pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Mike Derglow Jr. is the department head for historic preservation for CSKT, and he is also the chair of the Climate Change Advisory Council for CSKT and a leading advocate for climate thought and resilience among tribal communities. And we're very lucky to have him speaking to us tonight, and he is a model not only for Montana, but for much of the nation. So with that, please go ahead, Mike.
Oops, already advanced. I'm already starting my slide presentation.
You go right ahead.
So I have to go back. How do I do that?
Don't worry about it. We got your
Okay.
title.
Okay. So Chalu, everybody. Chalu Petya Etchasweets Fluid Squek. Kitsu Quictum Oxmakana Kukaxlux Kawaska Klautla. Good evening, everybody. My name is Standing Grizzly Bear. My English name is Mike Derglow, as Maureen shared with you. I am the Preservation Department head for the tribe and also the Climate Change Advisory Committee chair. And so I just want to say, Kelsey and others, when we developed our plan in 2012, thank you, state of Montana, for doing all the scientific work that we used, the models and the projections to develop in the process of developing our plan. So a lot of that stuff is relative to what we look at here in Northwest Montana on our reservation. So everybody is familiar pretty much with where our reservation is. It's 1.3 million acres located in Northwest Montana, God's country, for those of you who have been through here. So I don't know what's going
on. You just muted yourself, Mike.
Okay.
There we go.
So here's this is the plan that we developed in 2012. We've been working since then. We not rewrote, but added to our plan in 2016, and currently are in the process of basically rewriting our plan based on the new models and projections that are telling us that what we were looking at in 2012, the impacts that we were thinking that were not going to happen till 2050, 2060 are happening right now. So, okay. So just recently, the tribal council passed a resolution basically proclaiming that climate change is a risk to our health and security and general welfare of the tribe, and directing necessary resources for climate change planning, mitigation, and adaptation, and to integrate resource sustainability and climate change mitigation and adaptation measures throughout the tribal government operations. This, for me, is a big thing. We've been doing climate change work since, well, forever, really. We just didn't call it climate change in a lot of cases, but whether it's stream restoration or those kind of things, it's all about climate change, and it's all about future generations. Do what we can to make sure that those things are around. Back then, the group was fairly small. 2012, 2002. I don't think this is everybody, but this is one of our gatherings during those planning workshops. I think this is one of our first ones. One of the main things that for myself and others, I think, that have worked on this plan is the recognition and the importance of our elders' contributions. One of the most special things about the process that I experience is interviewing or doing recorded visits with our elders, my dad being one of those elders, and just the fact that we are all connected as a people, as we're connected to our land, our animals, and our resources, and that is the basis for our spiritual life. It's our whole being, and the traditions and the culture that we rely on, the abundant populations of fish, wildlife, and healthy clean air and clean water, and so forth. The core values of our people, and I think a lot of people, I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer, but it basically talked about reciprocity and living in harmony with each other and the land, and all living things, even non-living things that we have a responsibility for, and the importance in understanding that our ancestors left this land for us, and basically we're borrowing it from our children. And that's, pretty much why I do what I do. That we have the respect for the land, respect for each other, and it's all about connectivity, communication, collaboration to protect our Mother Earth for future generations to come. This is a Lifeways model that we developed in the process of rewriting our plan. This basically represents, I call it my awake vision that I had, and I won't go into that whole vision, but it's about connectivity, and all of these things represent one of the sectors in our plan: the land, the water, the animals, the wildlife, the forest, and the people. There's 9 sectors in the plan, and if you would like to look at that, it's available on our website at csktclimate.org. So we heard from Kelsey that, all of these impacts that we're looking at and that we're feeling every day. I don't know how many of you felt the earthquake this morning. I don't know. That's probably not a climate impact, but it's like the different things that are happening now around us, and even in my lifetime, I'm seeing the different things that are occurring around us. But a lot of those things are being lost or altered or destroyed. Things that my my parents, my grandparents, my ancestors, my relatives taught me places to gather, places to hunt, what types of foods that we get at certain times of year. And sometimes those foods are just not available because of the changing climate. As we all know, we have seen a lot more and more intense wildfires. It seems like more recently, and that's you know a result of not just climate change, but our management practices. 100 years of fire suppression increases the fuel load. So we actively here on the reservation, I know that the fire and forestry crews are actively doing control burn to try to get some handle on those severe and intense wildfires. One of the major outcomes of the planning process is white bark pine, and we look at it as really one of our success stories, and it's biocultural of restoration as a science and practice. I'm not going to read all that. You guys can read that, but it's another quote from Dr. Kimmerer, and just basically that what we take from the land, we give back, and our cultural ways shape every aspect of our life and the purpose and goals of our life. And Maureen and Gwen, you guys can help me out at any time. It's getting to be almost my bedtime. So, one of the main
doing great.
really important things is teaching our kids about these things. This was up in Boulder before the burn. Was it last year or the year before? Up in that area in Boulder, we took a bunch of school kids up there to show them an area that forestry, Sheena Shaw and others have worked to identify plush trees, and just bringing them up there to have that experience is, so important. And talking about the cultural significance of white bark pine to our people as a food source, and a food source for over 100 species of animals, and snowpack retention. This is so awesome. This is 30,000 little baby white bark pines. The forestry is actively replanting white bark pines. I think I'm not sure, 3,000 last year, I think they planted. Not exactly sure of the exact number, but I tell people, it's about what we do for the future and how we protect the future generation, because those little baby white bark pines that they planted last year, you and I will not see them grow to maturity. I mean, some of you might, but it takes 60 to 70 years before those little babies will start producing their own seeds and their own cones. So that's pretty awesome, I think. And all of this work could not happen without all of you and all of the people, Maureen, Anne. I mean, there's so many people that have contributed to this process that I can't name everybody, especially the support of our tribal council, the support of our elders and others. If you look at my list of climate change advisory committee members, there's probably almost 100. And I'll tell people, once you're a member, you're a lifetime member. So if you're interested in joining us, you're welcome to, but remember, you become a lifetime member of our committee. There's my contact information. And
Wonderful.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. That was absolutely wonderful. It was great to see the resilience part of this talk. So it's not just about what's happening, but it's also about resilience. Mike, if you would be so kind as to stop screen share so that we can bring Gwen up. Here we go. Excellent. And Gwen, are you there?
Hi, Maureen. I'm here.
So Gwen is a stalwart member of the Climate Change Advisory Committee for CSKT, but she wears many hats. So Gwen, if you would be so kind as to give a short introduction and then talk to us about connections to the community in terms of climate resilience.
Thank you so much, Maureen. And thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate it. I always appreciate learning from you and being in the same spaces with you to just continue mentoring with you. Thank you also, Dr. Jensko. I appreciate the information you gave and also just the invitation to be here tonight. So thank you so much for that to start with. I primarily, in my professional life, I say that I do strategic communications, but I've done, I guess maybe you could say, constituency outreach for most of my professional life. So really engaging across constituencies. I really love the practice of taking seemingly disparate groups and helping them see and hear each other to create almost another movement. I think that's really exciting. I sit on the Climate Smart Missoula Board of Directors. And then, of course, I'm doing a lot of work with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. I'm a direct descendant of the Salish tribe. My mom is a Salish tribal member, and my father, where I am enrolled, is from Fort Belknap. So I'm Groban from the Fort Belknap tribe across the mountains. So I've got deep connections to this place, and I love it here. It's not a day that goes by that I'm not appreciative of being in my home area. I guess there's just so many things to think about. The presentation, as I was watching Dr. Jensko provide all the information, I don't know about any of the rest of you, but I could feel my blood pressure rising at times. There's certainly some predictions that are part of that science that can be a little nerve-wracking. Thinking of 39 more days of 90-degree plus weather in the summer is pretty intense, because it's certainly hard when we find ourselves at some point in the summer, which we're starting to count on a regular basis, not being able to breathe, not feeling safe to go outside, not feeling like it's safe to send our children outside. There's just so many parts to that. And what I always fundamentally really think about when I think of climate issues is I think of really kind of a bigger picture, is that climate is impacting resources. It's just impacting resources, the way that we understand them, the way that we engage with resources, and of course, the way that resources then impact us. And it seems like that picture of resources changing so rapidly, whether it be the impacts from rainfall or smoky days, whatever it is, we're certainly getting impacted a lot more, and resources are just changing. And I know, Maureen, you had asked me to talk more about kind of social justice and equity. And when I think about social justice and equity on a large scale and a collective scale, it's difficult for me not to first think about it on a really micro scale. And I think that's where I'm really interested in, is really thinking about kind of our value systems, I guess I would say, and how we think about our connection, our collaborative efforts with each other, but really how we're in reciprocity with each other. Michael mentioned that and talked about that as a really big part of the CSKT planning. And it's something that I think is critical as we move forward, and especially as we are in consideration of how resources are changing. And the picture that I always give is that currently a lot of our systems are really vertically integrated. They're integrated with a lot of the power on the top, with most of the resources consolidated with that power, a lot of the decision making. Just really, there's a lot of power on the top. One of the pictures I always like to give is from one of my kids' books, and it's Yertle the Turtle. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It's a Dr. Seuss story, but Yertle likes to be on the top of the mound, and he thinks he's king of the world. And all it takes, in fact, is for Mac to sneeze. And suddenly when Mac sneezes, it becomes really clear that it's an unsustainable, vertically integrated system. And it's in fact really, really vulnerable to that kind of consolidation of power, consolidation of greed, consolidation of resources. It makes the entire stack of turtles very, very vulnerable. I like to think more in terms of reciprocity, and this is what I really strive for, to understand, but also to help other people understand as well, as it's even developing in me. And that's something that's more like a horizontal integration. In a horizontal integration, if we were to say that all of us, in fact, were a point on the circle, we would all offer our gifts to that circle to make him stronger. So if I was good at something, let's say I was good at finding plants for medicinal purposes, but I wasn't good necessarily at finding and doing hunting, then I could offer my gifts to the middle of the circle or to the circle that's horizontally integrated. And I could count on somebody that's also in the circle to offer their gifts. I apologize. My dog is barking at something, so I'm sorry if you can hear that in the background.
Quite all right.
But again, if there's someone else that has a strength that is also part of the circle, then they can offer their gifts. And collectively, we're so much stronger when we do that, when we're in a horizontally integrated system where I recognize the value that you bring no matter what. That's a really critical piece of it, because I certainly cannot manage every aspect of surviving and thriving in the way that I can if I'm in a collective circle where there's more equity and there's reciprocity. That's a really critical difference, I think, in terms of how we need to revision systems and how we need to think about moving forward and how we think about resources in a more horizontally integrated system where we are really consciously sharing resources and not consolidating them in one place where maybe they even just get kind of left behind. You know, maybe some of the resources even get moldy after a while because they're just sitting in warehouses. When we're consciously looking and we're in a horizontally integrated system, resources, in fact, can go a lot further. And it's a really important aspect, I think, as we continue to move forward in the climate crisis, where resources are just changing so drastically. Another way that I like to think about that as well is, and this again, it starts in a really micro way. I've got children, I've got 2 children, and I remember when each of them was born. And if you've had the privilege to watch a baby be born, that first breath is really critical. It's, the communion of their spirit and their physical bodies. And it's that moment that you're like, oh, so wonderful. And you really feel, I feel at least, it was like witnessing a miracle, really that communion. And when the breath leaves the body is when, another iteration of a lifetime happens. But it's really one of those moments for me when I felt like I was witnessing a miracle, or I was witnessing something that was certainly bigger than me, some kind of divinity of sorts, I would even say. And I had to remember, when you're witnessing that also at some point I was that baby as well. And so I really need to understand the miracle that is my life, the miracle of me having the breath, of me being able to go out in the world. But more than that, when I understand that in myself, and I know that in myself, and especially as a mother witnessing it in my children, I also have to recognize that every other person, in fact, who has breath also has that light in them or that divinity in them. And I think it's, again, another really important aspect when we're thinking in terms of more equity or even thinking of reciprocity. If we're going to get into horizontally integrated systems with folks, I think, the question is always, are these people that we're going to get into this system with, are they worthy? Because obviously we're making some decisions in a vertically integrated system. Absolutely. We're making decisions that some people are more worthy than others, I would say, at least. But in a horizontally integrated system, that's the question, is whether or not other folks are worthy. And I would suggest that if there's a test you need to have for that, it's to find out if they're breathing. You have to recognize, again, there's a humanity and a dignity with every person, just by virtue of them being here. And that may be going into too much in terms of kind of more of a spiritual approach, but I do think it's a really important aspect in terms of thinking about the value of being in a different type of system and revisioning, quite frankly, the ways that we've built most of our systems to date. And I think we're all witnessing too that a lot of the systems that are built on deeply vertically integrated ways, they're crumbling before our eyes. Mac has sneezed and Yertle is falling down. And And it's painful and it's difficult. And, you know, I think some of the first instincts we have as we're witnessing and watching Dr. Jensko's predictions is, holy crap, it's going to get even crazier. You know, how can we think more equitably and remember again what Michael has told us, and that what something that we are taught as tribal people, and that is that we're all connected. It may not mean that I agree with you lock, stock, and barrel. It may not mean, you know, that we are always going to be in, I guess, acting even in kindness with each other, possibly. But the bottom line is we are connected. And what happens to me, I guess, especially in a system of reciprocity, is also going to eventually impact you. It's interesting too, when I think, in fact, of COVID as a really good picture of that. I would suggest that a lot of the really wild iterations of the pandemic that we've been witness to in the last couple of years have also had an underpinning of the lack of collectively caring for each other. I think there's been times when it was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad it's not in my backyard. We'll let that virus rage in the African American community, in a community that's more marginalized, that's certainly at the bottom of the turtle pile. We'll let it rage in another community, and thank goodness it's not in my backyard. But eventually, COVID has been such a good picture to show us that we are connected, and ultimately, it will nip you in the bud if it's something that you're not thinking about in terms of a collective way, about, you know, just humanity moving forward. I also have had something that I learned a couple weeks ago. James Whitfield was in Missoula offering kind of different ways to think about equity. Missoula County and the city of Missoula have actually done a pretty stellar job of putting language or codifying language around equity. And he was an invited guest here to speak and to do kind of a seminar of sorts for a couple of days in regards to how do you operationalize equity. And one of the things that was really profound to me is he was talking about the word kind and acting with kindness toward each other. And a lot of times I would say that we all will act with kindness towards each other when we like each other. But at the root of the word kind is actually the word kin. And so, in fact, if you look, the etymology of the word kind is about treating each other like kin. It's about treating each other like family. And again, I love that picture of, again, reciprocity. And I think it's a really important aspect of it. And sometimes we don't always get along. I've got a big family. You know, I can say there's been times I've had disagreements with my family or my sisters or, you know, even my children, but there's still an understanding that I'm connected to them and that it matters in regards to my gestures and what I offer into that relationship, because I know it will also come back to me as well. So those, I guess, are some of the thoughts that I had in regards to reciprocity. And I just appreciate being here. Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Gwen, thank you so much for that. We had, when we designed this webinar, we wanted to be able to bring you the climate information, but also to give you an opportunity to hear about resilience, because it is sometimes overwhelming and daunting. So I do appreciate, Gwen, you were the perfect way to end our formal presentations, because you gave us hope. And I think we all need that right now. So with that, I'm going to turn to some questions. Kelsey, if you would be so kind as to pop your screen back on. I'm going to go through a few of the questions. Some have been addressed in part in the chat and the Q&A box, but I'd like you to also touch on them. First, coming back to the issue of the things that you talked about, in particular, the warming temperatures. Could you give us a little bit of a profile as to how the temperatures, the precipitation, how does that translate into growing seasons? And are we going to have better growing seasons or worse? And what do we have to think about if we're in the business of everything from gardening to growing crops to raising cattle? What does that mean for
Great.
us?
Yeah, great question. And Kyle did a really good job of answering that in the chat. I think as we think about growing seasons and growing season lengths, that's traditionally calculated based upon temperature, and the temperatures at which specific crops and varieties of crops can grow. And so from a temperature perspective, the growing season window, that time is expanding into our shoulder seasons, right? Earlier in the spring, later into the fall, we have warmer temperatures. The caveat there, right, when we think about the duration in which a plant can grow, is changes in precipitation and that moisture that's available to crops, to plants, and how much access they have to that moisture, right? So it's not just the temperature units and the phenology of the plant, but it's also how much water is available. And so we have to take that into account as we think about, the positive side is that increased CO2 coupled with longer temperatures enhances the potential for growth in the growing season, but with limitations in water, as we all know, just from a gardening perspective, right? If you don't water your garden, it wilts and dies. So the moisture aspect here is really critical and important. And as we think about our summer time periods, that's where we are anticipating much warmer temperatures and decreases in summertime precipitation.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelsey. I appreciate that. Gwen and Mike, I'm going to tee up a question that asks you for a little bit more actionable details. The concept of moving from vertical organizations to horizontal organizations. Mike, you gave a very nice picture of that in terms of the LifeWays wheel. What does that mean in practice for those of us dealing with the climate crisis? So Gwen, would you like to start out? Did I put you on the spot?
Do you want me to take it here, or do you want to handle this? I don't want to you want me to take it? Okay. Thank you. I don't want to step on Michael if he had something to say. I guess I know that sometimes I can certainly be somewhat esoteric, and it is important, obviously, to bring kind of boots to the ground. Maybe another picture, though, would be helpful. We can also think about maybe vertically integrated systems in concentric circles. That might be another picture that's helpful for people. So if we were to look at concentric circles, we could look at maybe the inner circle, which we're familiar, I think, most of us, with what that kind of denotes in our mind. The inner circle being the main kind of middle of a concentric system, where in that predominantly socially predominant part of a system, all the resources are there. There's decision-making ability to how those resources are allocated, just decisions generally across the board that then end up kind of fanning out into the greater concentric circles, where you start to get into more marginalized populations that don't have access to that predominant inner circle. They don't have access to influence necessarily the predominant inner circle. And we certainly know that in a lot of ways. We're really familiar with that when we look across the landscape and we look at kind of, again, social systems, or when we look at, again, just how a lot of things are built and how they're kind of executed in the world. So in terms of operationalizing and creating more equitable systems, it's really critical, in fact, to think about, how can we create a space where, again, there's true collaboration? I think a lot of times we all have our own inner circles, which is kind of amazing. Every single one of us will have a place in our lives where we are part of an inner circle. There's all kinds of different ways that you can be part of a predominant part of kind of social fabric. But there's also places every single one of us have where we're also marginalized to some extent. And some people more than others are marginalized for, again, all kinds of reasons. That's a whole nother thing we could get into. But the key is, are we really truly creating collaborative spaces? I think it's really important to think about that. Are we creating almost a separate table? There's always that saying of like setting a table and inviting everyone to the table. Is there truly a space where that predominant part of our society, or those places where the inner circles operate, where they can create a table and really truly invite everyone for collaborative discussions? That's really important. And when I say collaboration, there's a compromise in that, right? You can't get to the table and just ask clarifying questions just to clarify or to make yourself feel good. Really deeply being in true collaboration means there's a give and a take and almost a compromise on all the parts that are there. It's not just clarifying questions to continue to move your agenda forward, but truly being in collaboration means hearing and understanding, and maybe even putting yourself again in the perspective of a more marginalized concentric circle. And so I think that's really critical. One of the things that I think that is really difficult, especially as just kind of society develops, is again embracing the conflict in collaborative partnerships. When you get into partnerships and it just feels good and everyone's singing to the choir and it's like, oh, this is great. The beauty of conflict is that it raises a perspective, it raises a question, and it really clarifies things. And to be able to embrace that in the midst of collaborative partnerships is really critical. I think a lot of times when conflicts are raised or there's a question, and bless the people that are courageous enough to bring conflicts forward, there's a tendency, especially if it puts us in a place of discomfort or a place where we don't feel like we want to compromise, kind of our first instinct is just take them out, like completely diminish them and just go back to singing in the choir. It'd be so much easier if we were all just like singing the same tune. But again, it's imperative that we create horizontally integrated systems and that we recognize, for better or worse, we are connected to each other. And that takes a lot of work, and it takes that collaborative, that true spirit of collaboration, which sometimes means that conflicts will be raised. But to have a determination and a real investment in that space that brings truly collaborative partnerships to the table is really critical. So I hope that answered that question, but.
Excellent. And Mike, in your practice, what does that climate resolution mean in terms of what the tribe will be doing in order to address that resolution? And how is that being reflected across all of the organizations?
I just think about one of that picture that Ron Oden drew for me about the Salish canoe, and we're all on the canoe. It's like I think about that, and it's like we're all in this boat together, and we all have to do our part and paddle the boat. I know that part. For me, it's really exciting to have this resolution because it gives me support, gives us support within the whole tribal organization. Whereas, before I jokingly said, when people see Mike Durglow coming down the hall, they're going to lock their doors and close their windows and pull their shades down because they know darn well that Mike's going to ask them to do more. But we all have to do more. Just like Gwen is saying, I mean, it's our responsibility. And whether we're, setting the table, whether we're cooking a dinner that we're going to share around the table, we're all there together, and we all have a responsibility.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. That also helps give us a little bit of hope. Kelsey and perhaps Mike to join in. Kelsey, can you talk to us a little bit about what the climate impacts that you discussed, what this means for the forested region in Montana, and are there management practices? Mike, you gave that horrifying picture of the boulder fire across Flathead Lake last summer. Are there management practices we really need to think about, whether it's reforestation or it's protecting the forests we have, to keep not only our forests intact, but potentially, hopefully to keep our snowpack intact.
Wow. We could talk about that all night. And I would, what I'd start with is
And
that
you've got 2 minutes.
that is an active area of research debate. You know, what I'd start out saying is that we are in an ecological unprecedented ecological experiment in our Western U.S. forests in terms of aridification and changes to forests, both just with aridification, changes in snowpack, but also with catastrophic and stand replacing wildfire, right? And so as we think about the forests of our future, it's critical to not only understand kind of our current forest habitat and species that are distributed within various habitats, you know, across elevation gradients or across the larger west-wide US, but also what are conditions that these forests are going to see as we move into the future. And so it becomes a little bit controversial when we think about, you know, what are the species that will persist and where will they persist? There's a lot of discussion about climate refugium and these kind of where are the wet spots in our landscapes that are less susceptible to climatic changes. That's something that, you know, a lot of research is focused on. And I think it's key for us to identify those zones so that we know where we have these kind of species level niches and potential climate refugia that trees may expand and grow outward from again. Are there practices in terms of retention of snowpack? Absolutely. And in terms of our water supplies, you know, we can think about gradients in both moisture with elevation, but also with aspect and impacts of kind of warming on various aspects. Where do we get the most bang for our buck in terms of our forest practices and forest management practices? I look at forest management as kind of the tip of the spear when we talk about our forested ecosystems and how we can sustain those. And so there are a variety of approaches out there for that as well in terms of thinning practices and thinking about how we can sustain that winter snowpack. Zach Hoylman's online and Zach and I have conducted a lot of research focused on kind of identifying both hydrologically from groundwater systems and snowpack and water storage, but also where trees are going to be more likely to grow and persist in our landscapes as climate changes. I'll stop there. Mike, Mike, you might add some input.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Kelsey.
Excellent. And what you're seeing here, and I hope for everybody who is online, what you're seeing is the merging of both the Western science world of understanding what has happened and what the climate projections are, joined with traditional knowledge about how the landscape has functioned in the past and how we can build a more resilient ecosystem that includes us. We are not separate from in the future. So that's incredibly beneficial for us to understand the challenges. So with that, we have just 3 minutes left, which is lucky because you each get something less than a minute to close out with some closing comments. So I will go in reverse order. So Gwen, if you would be so kind as to give us just your 30-second parting words to this group on what they can think about in their own lives, and most importantly, what they can do to deal with the climate extremes that we have in our state.
Thank you again for having me tonight. And I really appreciate all the information and all the gifts that everyone has shared tonight in terms of their area. We have to stay grounded in the science, and I appreciate the science aspect. And Michael, I always appreciate learning from you and hearing more and learning more about Indigenous pathways. I think, again, for me, I know when I really think about systems, especially value systems, what we value is what we move toward. And so again, in terms of being more resilient, it's for me really trying to revision the systems that we are watching crumble with different values infused into them. And those values, again, are around just reciprocity. And again, finding value in not only each other as humans, but also knowing that my life also depends, in fact, on clean air, water, land, and animals. And that, in a nutshell, or maybe not a nutshell, there's quite a bit more, but certainly reciprocity is just something that I just hope I continue to learn more and more about and understand. And I just feel really honored for being in the position that I am, and to have the opportunity to continue to learn about that, and to be able to figure out how to practice it and help people understand it as well. So thank you again.
Thank you, Gwen. Mike, give us your parting messages.
Words of wisdom, eh?
Yeah, words of wisdom.
Yeah. Everybody get on a boat and grab a paddle. I don't know. I feel so humbled and honored, just to be here. But the other thing is, I always think about what my elders said to me and to us about, really having that responsibility. And it's not what I don't do what I do for me. I do it for the next generation. So we're doing what we're doing for the next 7 generations and beyond. And hopefully we're doing the right thing.
Thank
I think
you.
so.
Thank
I
you.
think so.
And not only the next generation, but the next 7 generations. An important perspective. So Kelsey, give us your final parting shot. What do we need to think about, and how do we make ourselves resilient from the science world?
Yeah, I think first what I'd like to say is thank you to Gwen and Mike for pretty captivating and moving talks. I think, when I give a talk about projections of climate change, it oftentimes feels a bit doom and gloom. And Gwen, you did a really good job of highlighting that there's got to be reciprocity and that we're part of a circle. And I think, from the perspective of a science-based approach to climate change, I think there's a lot of information and power in the data itself, right? And this need for us to continuously update the data so that we go into the future with informed decisions, that we can start to think about prioritization of how we might adapt and how we need to make changes to the turtle hierarchical. That was a great analogy, by the way. It took me back to books with my kids. But so that we can better plan and adapt to these changes, we have to do it. And I think science and updated defensible science is key to that process. I think the other thing I'd say is that, learning from one another, and I think influencing one another through incremental changes. I know there's some neighbors online that have influenced me over time in their practices, and that's made a difference in terms of my day-to-day life and my contributions to this huge problem that we're all facing. So I think that community-based response and demonstrating potential for change through individual leadership is really important. As time progresses, we'll all kind of contribute to that process. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelsey. And thank you, Kelsey, Gwen, Mike, for your presentations. They were absolutely wonderful. Much appreciated. Zach and Kyle, thank you very much for being online, and Holland and Kyle for answering questions on the fly. And most of all, we thank you all for being with us this evening. We know it was a long, late evening, luckily a cold, snowy one. And we hope that you got a perspective of what Montana's climate is projected to be, but most importantly, where you fit in the equation and what we can do to work together to address the climate crisis in Montana. We only touched a few of the questions that were asked, and we did the best we could. So to those whose questions were not addressed specifically, thank you for your patience. We will be posting this webinar on the League of Women Voters website and YouTube channel. I can follow up with the participants on this to make sure that you have the link to that. We will also post whatever resources we can from the talk for those who wanted additional resources to go along with this. So with that, I wish everybody to stay safe this evening, to enjoy our early winter in Montana, and to think about where you fit in this community, because we're all in this together. So as Mike says, grab a paddle. It's our turn to start paddling, hopefully all in the same direction. So with that, good night, and we look forward to seeing you again on our next climate webinar. Take care.